Thank you very much for joining the webinar today. This webinar is sponsored by the Department on Disability and Human Development through the TAP Institute on Disability and Human Development and Leadership Education and Neurodevelopment Disabilities Program, the LEND program. We are very excited to have the following presenter, Helen Rottier, with us today. And now I will turn it over to Helen.
Thank you, Anam. Before I get started, I don't see the captioning appearing, and I noticed in the chat someone mentioned that the captioning wasn't appearing as well. Is there a problem with the captioner, or am I just not seeing it?
Helen, whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me, Anam?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I didn't see the captioning appearing, and there was a chat that the captioning wasn't appearing. Oh, Rhonda said she's looking into it. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, we're working on getting that back up.
I will go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Helen Rottier, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a master's and PhD student in disability studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago and pursuing a graduate concentration in gender and women's studies. And I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and gender and women's studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. On the screen, there is a picture of me. I am a young white queer person with short blonde hair, glasses, wearing silver earrings, and a black and white dress. And I also have on the screen the logos for UIC and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today I'm going to be presenting about autism and gender identity. I will start with an overview of Gender Identity 101, explaining gender identity, as a social construct, some terms related to gender identity, and gender justice. I'll move on to discuss autism and gender, specifically autism in women and girls, and autism and trans identities. I'll conclude with best practices for supporting and empowering autistic people of all genders in the work that you do. And at the end, I'll be able to take questions. So as Anam mentioned, you can submit your questions through the chat. The learning objectives for this session are to introduce you to gender identity and gender justice, discuss the intersection of autism and gender identity, understand the impact of diagnostic bias, and learn best practices for working with autistic people of all genders. To start, we're going to share some information about gender identity and gender as a social construct. Gender is socially constructed, which means that gender roles and expectations are established within cultures and are not something that is innate to a human being. Gender expectations are communicated to young children by family, friends, teachers, traditions, and media. The fact that gender is socially constructed is important because when we're understanding autism, it has a lot to do with social roles and social social expectations. Understanding gender this way means that Sorry, I'm having some technical issues on my end. Understanding gender this way means that it's important to understand how gender shapes social roles and expectations when communicating such roles and expectations to autistic clients and people in our lives. Secondly, gender is multifaceted. Gender identity is the way you personally understand your gender. This may mean you identify as a woman, as a man, as non-binary, as transgender, or as cisgender, or any other number of identities. The most important thing to remember about gender identity is summed up by one of my favorite quotes, which is, "It is an identity, not a you-dentity." That means your identity is personal and significant to you and belongs to you alone. No one else can tell you how to identify or determine what your identity is for you, although other people, and especially communities, can be helpful in determining how we identify. Gender expression is the way you demonstrate your gender to the world. This can be through clothes, hairstyle, voice, and behavior, and other ways that you signify your gender. And gender presentation is the way others perceive your gender and gender identity. On the screen, it says, "Gender is less like this," with two figures, one blue representing male and one pink representing female. And on the next slide, text that says, "and more like this," with a myriad of rainbow figures representing the various gender identities and gender expressions that exist. It's important to recognize that gender is individual and unique to each person. Even two men or two women may not have the experience of their gender. You may have heard the terms cisgender and transgender when describing someone's gender identity. Cisgender describes an individual whose sex assigned at birth matches their gender identity. For example, someone who is assigned female and identifies as a woman. Transgender describes an individual whose sex assigned at birth does not match their gender identity. For example, someone assigned female who identifies as a man, or someone assigned female or male who identifies as non-binary, gender fluid, agender, or gender nonconforming. The transgender umbrella encompasses transgender men and transgender women, non-binary people, genderqueer people, gender fluid people, agender people, and all other people with non-normative or non-cisgender gender identities. On the screen there is an image of an umbrella to represent the transgender umbrella. If you have questions about any of these terms and what they might mean, you can enter those into the chat box. Gender justice affirms every person's right to thrive, regardless of their gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. On the screen is an image of the scales of justice. Gender justice is the movement that fights for everyone's ability to perform their gender as they are comfortable, to have access to opportunities regardless of their gender identity, and to feel safe and comfortable expressing their gender identity. You may be wondering, what does this have to do with autism? To understand how autism and gender identity are related, you first need to understand the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality, theorized by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, is the notion that social identities are interconnected and overlapping. For example, race affects gender, affects disability status, and so on. A disabled woman's experience is unique as a disabled woman, just as a Black man's experience is unique as a Black man, or a transgender autistic person's experience is unique as a transgender autistic person. On the screen, there's a Venn diagram symbol with some overlapping circles to show the way that identities overlap and intersect. I'm now going to present a little bit about autism in women and girls. Autism is understood as a boy's disease, especially affecting white boys who are in elementary school or younger. But we know that autism affects people of all genders and races and affects people across the lifespan. For every 4 boys who receive an autism diagnosis, only 1 girl receives a similar diagnosis, although new research suggests this ratio is closer to 3 to 1, while others believe the actual ratio is closer to 1 to 1. On the screen, there are 4 blue figures representing boys and 1 pink figure representing girls. Girls are also diagnosed later than boys or diagnosed with other psychological or behavioral conditions. Girls are diagnosed on average 1 to 2 years later than boys, and during this time miss out on crucial self-understanding and services that could aid them. Girls are also misdiagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, borderline personality disorder, anxiety disorders, and depressive disorders, when in fact they present symptoms of autism. Lack of diagnosis or late diagnosis leads to lack of supports and services, increased bullying and social exclusion, decreased self-awareness and understanding, and increased depression, stress, and anxiety. Therefore, it's important to recognize the diagnostic gap that affects women and girls and strive to increase identification for this population. Why are girls diagnosed later and less? There are several theories as to why girls are diagnosed later and less with autism than boys. The first theory is the biological protective effect. That is, girls are simply less likely to be autistic because of some innate biological or genetic function that protects them from the risk of autism. Another theory is that girls present with a type of female autism that features more internalizing symptoms like anxiety, shyness, and less destructive or externalizing symptoms that show up in boys. However, both of these theories fail to account for transgender autistic people and dismiss the experiences of autistic women and girls who have more typical autism symptomology. Another theory is that gendered socialization of young children affects the way girls are perceived from a young age. Our expectations of young children differ based on the gender they were assigned at birth. Because of our differing expectations, we might recognize symptoms of autism easier in boys than we do in girls. A related challenge is peer-to-peer social demands. That is, girls are expected to fit in with their peers on a different level and in different ways earlier on than boys. To fit in, girls may have to develop coping strategies faster that cover over their autism symptoms. This is related to camouflaging and masking, which are coping strategies autistic children and adults use to hide their autism symptoms and fit into groups. Camouflaging and masking can be exhausting, and there's ongoing research on whether autistic women and girls camouflage and mask more or to a greater extent than boys, and if this is related to diagnostic biases. Finally, all of the diagnostic criteria developed for autism are based on research and experiences of autistic men and boys. Because of this, we may be missing critical aspects of the autistic experience for women and girls in our diagnostic criteria that leads to girls being diagnosed later and less. Two key questions to ask about autism in women and girls are, how do we ensure autistic women and girls get the support and services they need to thrive? And how do we address biases and sexism in the autistic community and in autism services? Keep both of these questions in mind, and if you have a specific question related to either of these, feel free to type it in the chat. There is also emerging research on autism and transgender identities. Autistic people seem more likely to be transgender or gender nonconforming than non-autistic people, and transgender people seem to be more likely to be autistic than cisgender people. We're not quite sure why either of these is true, but emerging research, specifically anecdotal research, confirms both of these facts. On the screen, there's a 3-panel comic from Assigned Male Comics by Sophie LaBelle. In the comic, 2 children are lying in the grass holding hands. The first child, Child A, says, "I noticed most trans kids I know are also on the autism spectrum. Is there a link?" Child B says, "I think autistic kids are overrepresented in the trans population because we give less Fs about what people think, so we're more likely to express gender variance." But the real question is how our flesh vessels can bear so many awesome traits. And Child A says, "I was wondering that too." Some key questions to ask about autism and trans identities are, why do autism and trans identities co-occur so frequently? And how does this affect the way we work with autistic, transgender, and intersecting populations? On the screen, there's an image of the transgender pride flag. I'm going to review some general best practices for working with autistic people of all genders, and particularly autistic women and trans people. The first is to check your biases, challenge your assumptions about gender. You can't know what someone's gender is simply by looking at them. You can only know if they tell you. Respect others' gender identities and honor others' gender expression, identity, name, pronouns, and preferred terms. If you work in a clinical setting, it's important to ask clients what name and pronouns they would like you to use, and if it's safe to use this name and pronouns when you're speaking with parents or other caregivers. Recognize how gender affects social dynamics, skills, and expectations. As I mentioned before, gender is socially constructed, which means it's important when we're focusing on social skills and rules to understand the role gender plays in navigating social situations. For example, if you are a man teaching social skills to an autistic girl, you may have different ideas about the way to navigate the world than another woman might have. The same goes for transgender people. Finally, continue to learn about gender, gender justice, and the intersection of gender and autism. Ask questions about gender, gender justice, and autism. Use what you know to support autistic people of all genders, making adaptations as necessary. For the most part, what you do with one autistic person may work or may not work with another autistic person, regardless of their gender. But it's important to understand the role gender plays in how we navigate the world to ensure that what you're teaching and guiding people to do is appropriate for them and will keep them safe. You can find additional resources through the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and Thinking Person's Guide to Autism. All of these resources employ people, autistic people who are women and autistic trans people. Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network in particular has lots of resources about how to work with autistic women, girls, and transgender people. And now I'll take your questions, but first I wanted to share that you can feel free to email me with additional questions or to request more information at hrotti2@uic.edu. And on the screen, there's a word cloud from Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network that says trans-inclusive, respect, neurodiversity, intersectionality, community, disability rights, autism acceptance. And with that, I'm available to take questions.
Hi, Helen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So someone asked, can you explain, just a second. Can you explain the use of pronouns and uses I'm not sure how to incorporate in my daily life?
Yeah. The easiest way to incorporate pronouns into your daily life is to start by introducing yourself with your pronouns. For example, at the beginning of the webinar, when I introduced myself, I shared that I use she, her, hers pronouns. I hope I did. Now I'm forgetting if I did or not. Introducing your own pronouns, whether you use he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, or some other set of pronouns, is a good way to model pronoun usage and get the conversation started. It will make other people feel safe to share their pronouns with you because they recognize that you're someone who's willing to share and who will make an effort to respect their pronouns. If you have trouble with someone's pronouns, or if you use the incorrect pronouns, the best thing to do is just to quickly correct yourself and then continue speaking. If someone else in a group uses someone's pronouns incorrectly, only correct them if you know that that person has shared their pronouns with the other person you're speaking to. You can practice using pronouns by giving someone, making several statements or compliments about a person. For example, if I'm talking about my friend, if I'm talking about my friend Endeavor, I would say, they're a good friend, they send me letters, their cat is really cute. You can practice that way to get familiar with using pronouns and get more practice and more familiarity, and that helps you use them to and I see another question that says, are you using the pronouns instead of their names? You can use pronouns and names interchangeably, just like you would with any other person. So if in a situation you would use someone's name, use their name. But if you would use their pronouns, use their pronouns.
Thank you, Helen. And you did use your pronouns in the beginning. We've got another question about, can you recommend any primary, oh no, I'm sorry, Jajan had a question. Can you share any good books, if available, on this intersection?
One that I'll definitely recommend that's not specifically on this intersection, but definitely touches on this intersection is All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism. One of the editors of the book, Lydia X.E. Brown, identifies as non-binary and discusses her identity as non-binary, Asian, and autistic in the book. There's also a book from the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network called Things Every Autistic Girl Wishes Her Parents Knew, that I recommend for parents or anyone new to the autism landscape to check that out. My friend Haley actually did the cover art for that book. And there are, I would also recommend the Loud Hands anthology, which includes work by autistic women and autistic trans and non-binary folks. And you can find in a lot of autism anthologies work that touches on these intersections. There's also a new anthology that I believe is called Spectrums that is specifically about autism and trans identities.
Thank you. So we have another question. It says, let's say if I am autistic and queer gender and a neurotypical wants to know how my autism is connected with my gender queerness, how may I go about explaining both of those identities without going into deep detail or over explaining?
That's a really good question. I'm not going to explain this as well as some other people do, but I find that my autistic identity is tied explicitly to my gender identity because of the ways that I experience and navigate the world are so interrelated to gender and to autism. So I think coming up with examples of how navigating the world is shaped by those identities would be the best way to share that with someone who's neurotypical.
Thank you for answering that. Got another question. Can you recommend any primary or secondary sources for historical information touching on gender identity and people with traits we would now associate with developmental disabilities?
That's a good question. The first one that comes to mind is Steve Silberman's Neurotribes, which touches on kind of the history of autism as a diagnosis and really looks at how the early diagnostic criteria were shaped around researchers' experiences with autistic boys. There were very few girls included in that research. So that's one. And I would say send me an email so I can do some more digging and check into that, because that's a really good question, but I don't have anything off the top of my head.
Okay, so for books, are there recommendations for general audience and or academic professional audiences?
Yeah. So all of the anthologies I mentioned, so Loud Hands, edited by Julia Bascom, All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism by the Autism and Race Collective, including Morinki Go and Lydia X.E. Brown and E. Ashkenazi. There's a new anthology called STEM out by Lizzie Huxley Jones that I haven't read yet, but is supposed to be really good. And the Spectrums anthology, edited by Maxfield Sparrow, would all be appropriate for general audiences or academic audiences, and are good ways to kind of get into autistic own voices perspectives and understand those more. I'm trying to think of more academic texts would include Steve Silberman's Neurotribes, which I mentioned. Probably What Every Autistic Girl Wants Her Parents to Know or Wishes Her Parents Knew would be a general audience book. That's a really good starting place or introduction. And trying to think of others. The new The Autistic Community and Neurodiversity Stories from the Front Lines anthology, edited by Stephen Kapp, is a good academic text. And the new Neurodiversity as a Critical Paradigm book that just came out this week would be another good academic text. And if you're interested in any of these and didn't catch the names, feel free to email me and I can connect you with all of these resources and books and stuff.
Great, thank you. So we have another question. Do you know how to find specific resources such as support groups for people with autism who are also transgender, non-binary, especially in Chicago or near suburbs?
I know there's at least one neurodiverse queer kind of like social group in the Chicago area. That's on Meetup. So if you look up like neurodiverse queer group on Meetup, you'll find that. Otherwise, there is the Coalition for Autistic and Neurodivergent Students. We have several, some women in our group and some trans folks that attend, and we try to make that group really welcoming of everyone. So that would be one that if you're interested in the Coalition for Autistic and Neurodivergent Students in the Chicago area, definitely email me and I can get you connected there.
Wonderful. We had a question about some of the terms that you included. So we have, I love that you identified transgender umbrella, transgender men and transgender women, non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, and agender. What do each of these terms?
Yeah. So transgender men are people who were assigned female at birth, but identify as men. Transgender women are people who are assigned male at birth, but identify as women. Non-binary people identify as neither male nor female, so experiencing a separate gender identity. Genderqueer is kind of more broad and can mean a lot of different things, but mostly relates to like non-binary or kind of outside of normative gender binary terms. Gender fluid is an identity for someone who may identify as one gender one day and another gender another day or week or month. So they identify as different genders depending on the time. And agender refers to someone who does not identify with any gender or is kind of identifies as genderless. Hopefully that was useful.
Thank you for breaking those down. What has been your experience as a late diagnosed autistic woman?
Yeah, my experiences have been really interesting. I definitely fell into the pathway of getting misdiagnosed several times over as I ventured towards my autism diagnosis. I was identified, doctors said that I had obsessive compulsive disorder, which I don't, and bipolar disorder, and personality disorders, and anxiety and depression, and all of these things. And I had pretty much every diagnostic label in the book all kind of cobbled together to make something that didn't really quite fit still. And then I really started researching and studying autism as an undergraduate, and got really involved in neurodiversity through these other lenses and other diagnoses, and got kind of got started to pick up steam in understanding autism and studying autism. And I was sharing this with my psychiatrist one day, who said, "Do you think you could be autistic?" And I had never thought about it. And I think definitely being a woman and being a queer person kind of limited how people viewed me, because autism is so male dominated, that it had just never come up before. But when I started to think about it, it really made sense and really fit.
Thank you for sharing that. We have another question. Have you noticed gender differences among your autistic students?
Yes, I definitely recognize some gender differences among autistic students that I work with and among autistic people in general. I think most dominantly is that autistic people tend to either have a really strong sense of gender and gender identity, or have kind of an ambivalence about gender and gender identity. And I fall into the later category. So sometimes I feel like gender is just like too difficult to untangle and like pick apart. So I could just kind of go with the flow, I guess. But I have also met autistic people who really identified with their gender. I've met a lot of autistic people and autistic students who identify as transgender, or genderqueer. And I'm trying to think of like what some of the big gender differences are. I work primarily with college students, and I think some of the gender differences flatten out as you get older, because in the past I've worked with much younger children, and you can see more prominent differences, especially in that externalizing and internalizing dichotomy. And it's not true for every autistic child, but in general, there seems to be more of those externalizing behaviors among boys. So that's more outwards. It can be disruptive or destructive behaviors. It can be more visible behaviors, versus the internalizing with young girls, which is like the shyness, anxiety, fear of things. So things that are a little bit harder to see.
Great, thank you. We have a question. Can you say something about what you found in your master's thesis on this topic?
Yeah, it was actually really interesting when I conducted the research for my master's thesis, which I'll be defending next Monday. I found that, first of all, in my sample, the majority of participants were women, which was really unusual. And I thought that was really interesting, that somehow in our sampling, which we did through college departments and disability services offices and through these autistic organizations that I shared with you, somehow through all of that we sampled more women than men. And I don't know if that has to do with who takes online surveys when they get an email about them, or who we were reaching through those autism organizations, if those are tend to be more female or women heavy. But we also found a lot of interesting results about quite a few people in the sample identified as transgender and non-binary, which is really compelling. And quite a few people in their responses to the survey mentioned that finding an LGBTQ plus community in college was a facilitator to their college experience, along with finding community around disability and autism. So it's really fascinating to me that we, one, had so many women and trans folks complete the survey, and I don't know if that's just because of who's in my networks or who's in the networks that we reached out to distribute, or who takes online surveys when they get an email about them. But it was really fascinating to get those perspectives, and I think overall the eagerness to share was really prevalent in my thesis research, that people were yearning to share their stories and to share what their experiences have been, because they're just questions that don't get asked very often, and certainly don't get asked of autistic women and trans people.
Thank you for sharing that, Helen. One of the questions we have is, how can we be allies to autistic people of all genders?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is educating yourself about gender and gender identity. So hopefully you learned something from this webinar and you picked up on something or learned something new. Continuing to learn about gender identity and gender justice. There are a lot of great things you can read and explore about gender identity and gender justice. I definitely recommend, this is not from an autistic perspective, but Janet Mock's books taught me a lot about gender and gender identity, and just continuing to learn more and take what you learn and do something with it. I'm trying to think of specific ways that you can be allies, and I think, yeah, practicing things like pronouns and names and respecting those, and recognizing that that's, such an intimate part of someone is their name, and what you call them and how you refer to them. Recognizing the ways you navigate the world based on your own gender identity. So thinking about how that affects the way you walk down the street, or how it affects the way you interact with your friends or family, or what responsibilities you feel are connected to your gender identity. We talk a lot about caregiving when we talk about autism, and we know that overwhelmingly it's women and mothers that are doing the caregiving for autistic children, which isn't to say that fathers aren't involved, but we know that in families where disability is prevalent, these gender roles are reinforced to an even greater extent than they are in families without a child with a disability. So understanding how that plays out and how that affects things like gender roles and the workforce, and how people, like move in their careers and navigate life, and the emotional labor that goes into caregiving. All of these things are important to grasp and recognize when we think about autism and gender.
Thank you for explaining that. We have another question. We already talked about your thesis. Thank you so much for the presentation and everything that you shared today, Helen. Your email is right here if anyone else wants to reach out and has any more questions. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
I guess I would share that one of the key questions that I posed was, what do we do about sexism in the autistic community? And that's one that I really encourage autistic men and boys, and I know there are autistic men and boys doing work on this already. Eric Garcia and JP Ruiz are doing a lot of work around masculinity, Steve Lieberman as well, autism and masculinity. But thinking about how you can ensure that women, girls, and non-binary and trans folks are included in the autistic community, because the autistic community is meant to be a space for all autistic people. And the reality is there is sexism and there is sexual harassment that occurs in that community, online and in person. And so thinking about how to navigate that, and how, when you work with autistic clients or other autistic people in whatever capacity you work in, how we can impart these ideas about gender justice to autistic people as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Helen, for the presentation and for everything that you shared. Got a bunch of great questions. Appreciate it so much. And that should be the end of our presentation. Thank you.